There is a place in America that most people will never see. Not because it is hidden underground, not because it is across the ocean. It sits in the middle of Colorado, surrounded by mountains, under an open sky. But no one who goes inside ever really comes back the same. This place has a name, ADX Florence, and today, you are going inside. Before we go any further, what if someone told you that there are men living right now, today, in rooms smaller than your bathroom, who have not felt the sun on their skin in over a decade? What if someone told you that some of these men have been in complete isolation, no friends, no family, no human touch for longer than most of you watching this have been alive? And what if the most shocking part is not how they suffer? What if the most shocking part is how some of them survive? Stay with us, because what you are about to find out will change the way you think about the human mind forever. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the things we cover on this channel, you do not want to miss them. ADX Florence opened in 1994 in Fremont County, Colorado. The full name is the Administrative Maximum Facility. The people who built it called it the safest prison in the world. The people who lived in it called it something else. One man called it a clean version of hell. Another said it was like being buried alive, but your heart is still beating. The prison was built after a series of violent incidents inside other high-security federal prisons in the 1980s. Guards had been killed. Inmates had taken over entire wings. The government decided it needed somewhere to send the people it considered the most dangerous, the most organized, and the most untouchable. So they built a place designed for one purpose: total control. Every single detail inside ADX was engineered to take away power. The furniture in each cell, the bed, the desk, the stool, is made of poured concrete. It cannot be moved. It cannot be turned into a weapon. The toilet is designed to automatically shut off if someone tries to flood the cell. Even the shower turns on and off by itself. Inmates cannot control it. The door to each cell is solid steel. It does not have bars like you might imagine a prison cell having. It has a small slot near the bottom, just big enough to slide a food tray through. And it has a small window. But that window does not look outside. It looks at a wall, or at the sky, but positioned so high up that a man standing in his cell cannot see the ground below. He cannot see a tree. He cannot see another human being walking. He sees sky, or he sees concrete. That is it. Each cell is roughly 7 feet wide and 12 feet long, smaller than most people's bathrooms. Inside this space, a man must eat, sleep, use the toilet, exercise, and exist for 23 hours every single day. For 1 hour, he is allowed outside. But even outside at ADX is not what you might think. The outdoor recreation area is a concrete pit, high walls on every side, a metal grate above instead of open sky. One former inmate described it as a concrete box with a lid. That is the 1 hour of freedom. Then it is back inside. Door closes, and the silence begins again. Now here is where things get interesting, because you might be thinking, okay, this sounds terrible, but how long can it really last? Surely people get moved out after a few months? Some men at ADX Florence have been in that kind of isolation for decades. Decades. Not months. Not a year or two. Decades. And here is the question that no one really asks loudly. What happens to a human mind when it is left alone in a concrete box for that long? Science actually has an answer, and it is disturbing. Researchers who study solitary confinement, which is the official term for this kind of isolation, have found that the human brain does not handle loneliness well. Not just emotionally, physically. The brain actually starts to change. Studies have shown that people in long-term solitary confinement begin to experience something that psychiatrists now call SHU syndrome. SHU stands for Special Housing Unit, which is the technical name for isolation areas in prisons. The symptoms of SHU syndrome include panic attacks that come out of nowhere, paranoia, meaning a person starts to believe things that are not true, like that people are plotting against them even when no one is there. Hallucinations, meaning hearing voices, seeing things that do not exist, and in serious cases, a complete break from reality. The symptoms of SHU syndrome include panic attacks that come out of nowhere, paranoia, meaning a person starts to believe things that are not true, like that people are plotting against them even when no one is there. Hallucinations, meaning hearing voices, seeing things that do not exist, and in serious cases, a complete break from reality. One forensic psychiatrist, a doctor who is an expert in both medicine and criminal behavior, was asked to evaluate 45 prisoners inside ADX. What she found was extraordinary. Roughly 70 out of every 100 men she examined met the medical criteria for at least one serious mental illness. Many of them had arrived at ADX without any diagnosed mental condition. The isolation itself had changed them. Think about that. The prison did not just hold them. In some cases, it made them sick. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Because not everyone broke. Some men, and this is the part that scientists, psychologists, and even the prison's own staff struggle to fully explain, some men found ways to hold on. Not just to survive, but in certain cases, to actually think more clearly than they ever had before. How? We are going to get to that. But first, you need to understand something about who actually ends up in ADX Florence. Because it is not random. These are not ordinary prisoners who committed ordinary crimes. To be sent to ADX, something specific has to happen. You have to be considered a threat so serious, or your crime has to be so significant, that the government believes no ordinary prison can hold you safely. Some of the names connected to ADX Florence over the years include people responsible for some of the most serious crimes in American history. Terrorists, spies, gang leaders so powerful that their influence supposedly reached across prison walls through other inmates acting as messengers. One man who spent years in ADX was connected to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Another was a former government agent who sold secrets to Russia for years. Another was a bomber who for nearly 2 decades sent explosive packages through the mail, killing people and injuring more. These were not small-time criminals who ended up in the wrong place. These were people the government considered genuinely dangerous, people they believed could still cause harm from inside a regular prison. And so they were sent somewhere they could not reach anyone. Somewhere communication was almost impossible. Somewhere they would be, for all practical purposes, alone. Now, we come to the part of this story that begins to feel almost impossible. One of the earliest things researchers and journalists noticed when they started investigating ADX Florence was something strange. The men inside, the ones who had been there the longest, many of them had developed extraordinary mental habits. One man, who had been in isolation for years, had memorized enormous amounts of religious text. Not because he had a book in front of him every day, but because he had recited it so many times, in the silence of his cell, that the words became permanent, stored in his memory like a hard drive. Another man, in complete isolation, with almost nothing, began writing thousands and thousands of words, legal documents, letters, personal reflections. He became so precise in his thinking, so sharp in his arguments, that he ended up being involved in a legal case that changed conditions inside the prison for hundreds of men. From inside a 7 by 12 concrete box, with almost no outside help. How does a human mind do that? The answer involves something deeply surprising about what extreme isolation actually does to certain people. And it connects to something scientists have discovered about boredom, focus, and the hidden power of the human brain. But that is where we are going next. Because first, you need to hear about the man they called the most dangerous prisoner in America. Not because of what he did before he went to ADX, but because of what happened to him after decades inside. His story is one of the strangest, saddest, and most revealing things we found in all of our research, and it will make you question everything you think you know about punishment, survival, and what it means to be human. He had been in isolation longer than almost anyone in American history, longer than most marriages last, longer than most careers. He went in as a young man. He grew old in that cell, and in the end, after all of that time, what he wanted more than anything was not freedom. What he wanted was something far simpler. Something you probably had this morning without even thinking about it. Drop a comment right now and tell us. Could you survive even 1 week in complete isolation? Be honest. We are reading every single one. His name was Thomas Silverstein, and before we tell you what happened to him, you need to understand one thing. When Thomas Silverstein arrived at ADX Florence, the government did not just put him in a cell. They built a special set of rules around him specifically. Rules that existed for one person and one person only. No other inmate in the entire United States federal prison system had rules written just for them. His rules had a name. They were called no human contact status, and they meant exactly what they sound like. No conversations with other inmates. Interactions with guards kept to the absolute minimum. When he was moved through the prison, entire sections were cleared out first, so he would not accidentally pass another human being in a hallway. For over 30 years, Thomas Silverstein lived like that. To put that in perspective, if you were 15 years old watching this, Thomas Silverstein was in complete isolation for twice as long as you have been alive. If you are 30, he was isolated for as long as you have existed on this earth. Now here is the part that changes everything you might be thinking right now. Thomas Silverstein was not a saint. He was not an innocent man. He had committed serious violence inside prison, and the government had real reasons to be concerned about him. We are not here to argue whether he deserved to be there. What we are here to tell you is what those 30 years did to a human being, and what that human being did back. Because Thomas Silverstein did something that nobody expected. He started drawing. In his cell, with the most basic materials available to him, he began making art. Detailed, careful, intricate drawings. Over time, his work became extraordinary. Portraits, scenes, images that showed a mind that was not dead, not broken, not empty. A mind that was reaching for something. He also started writing long, detailed accounts of his life, his thoughts, his experience inside ADX. He wrote about the loneliness in a way that was so clear and so precise that lawyers, journalists, and human rights organizations took notice. In one of his written statements, he described his existence not with rage, but with the quiet devastation that was somehow harder to read than anger. He said that what he missed was not the big things. He said the thing that haunted him most was the simple feeling of another person's presence. Not conversation, not touch, just the knowledge that another living human being was nearby. He had been without that for so long that he said he had almost forgotten what it felt like. He died in 2019 inside federal custody. He had spent more than 3 decades in conditions that the United Nations has officially described as a form of torture. But here is the twist that most people never hear. In all those years, despite everything that isolation did to him, Thomas Silverstein never stopped creating, never stopped thinking, never stopped producing something from inside that tiny cell. And the question that his case forces us to ask is this: why? What was driving that? What was keeping that part of him alive when everything around him was designed to make him feel like nothing? The answer to that question turns out to be one of the most fascinating things that modern psychology has discovered about the human mind under pressure. And it connects directly to how several other men at ADX found their own ways to hold on. But we need to talk about the ones who did not make it first, because their stories are just as important, and in some ways, they are even harder to hear. Jack Powers arrived at ADX Florence as a man who, by most accounts, was mentally stable. He had done something serious enough to end up there, but people who knew him described him as sharp, aware, and in control of himself. Then the years began to pass. The silence, the concrete, the 23 hours, the 1 hour, the food tray through the slot, the shower that turned itself on and off, the window that showed nothing but sky or wall. And Jack Powers began to fall apart. It did not happen all at once. That is one of the things that make solitary confinement so difficult to study and so difficult for outsiders to fully grasp. The damage is slow. It creeps in. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months. And somewhere in the middle of all that sameness, a person's grip on reality starts to loosen. Jack Powers began hurting himself. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, in ways that are deeply disturbing and that we will describe carefully here, because the truth matters, but we want to be respectful about it. He caused serious physical harm to his own body on multiple occasions. The details were documented by doctors and later used in court records. What those records show is a man who had lost the ability to cope with his environment. A man whose mind, without any external input, without any human connection, had turned against itself. After years of this, he was eventually moved to a lower security facility. You might think that would be the relief, the rescue, the beginning of recovery. It was not. Jack Powers found that after so many years in isolation, he could not function in an environment where other people were present. The social skills, the ability to read a room, the comfort of being around others, all of it had eroded away. The thing he had been deprived of for so long had become the thing he could no longer handle. The prison had not just taken years from him. It had taken something that could not easily be given back. His case became one of the most cited examples in academic research on the long-term effects of solitary confinement. Not because it is the most extreme case at ADX, but because it illustrates something that researchers keep coming back to. The damage done by extreme isolation does not stop when the isolation stops. Now here is where the story shifts direction again. Because while all of this was happening, while men like Jack Powers were being destroyed by the silence, something else was also happening inside those walls. Something organized, something determined, something that the prison authorities almost certainly did not see coming. A group of inmates at ADX, communicating in the only ways available to them through door slots, through legal mail, through the careful passing of handwritten notes, began building a legal case. Think about what that means for a moment. These are men in 7 by 12 cells. They cannot meet. They cannot talk freely. They have extremely limited access to phones and to outside counsel. Many of them have spent so long in isolation that their social skills are frayed and their mental health is fragile. And yet they organized. They gathered information. They documented their conditions. They described their medical situations, their psychological symptoms, their daily experiences in writing. And they found lawyers on the outside who were willing to listen. In 2012, that effort became a formal class action lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons. It was called Cunningham v. Bopp, and it was the first successful class action lawsuit ever brought against the Bureau of Prisons in American history. Let that land. Men in the most isolated prison in the United States, with almost no resources and almost no outside contact, won a legal battle that had never been won before. The case led to real changes inside ADX. Mental health evaluations were improved. Some conditions were reviewed. The process of how men were classified and housed was examined more carefully. It did not fix everything, not even close, but it happened. And the men who made it happen had done so from inside concrete boxes, using the only weapons they had left, their minds. This is the pattern that keeps appearing when you study ADX Florence closely enough. The men who survive the longest, the ones who do not completely collapse, are almost always the ones who find something to do with their minds, something with a purpose, something that extends beyond the 4 walls of their cell, even if only in their thoughts. One former inmate described it this way. He said that the moment he decided that his mind was the one thing the prison could not touch, everything changed. Not the conditions. The conditions stayed exactly the same. The concrete was still concrete. The silence was still silence. But something shifted in the way he related to his situation. He started treating his cell like a classroom. Every book he was allowed to receive, he read slowly and carefully, then went back and read again. He began memorizing things, not because he had a plan for using the information, but because the act of memorizing gave him something to do that felt like building rather than just waiting. He said that waiting felt like dying slowly, but building, even building something invisible inside your own mind, felt like living. Another inmate, who had a strong religious faith before arriving at ADX, described how his daily prayers became the structure that held everything else together. At ADX, time has a way of dissolving. Without meetings, without meals shared with others, without the normal markers that tell a person what part of the day it is, hours can become impossible to track. Days blur, weeks disappear. For this man, the 5 daily prayers of his faith became a clock. They broke the day into sections. They gave each part of the day a meaning and a name. And they connected him, in his mind at least, to millions of other people around the world doing the same thing at the same time. He was physically alone, but in his mind, he was part of something enormous. That feeling, researchers say, is not a small thing. It is not just comfort. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which certain people in extreme isolation manage to maintain what psychologists call a coherent sense of self, a stable feeling of who you are, where you belong, and why any of this matters. Without that, the self begins to fragment. And when the self fragments, everything else follows. Now, we come to something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss ADX Florence, the step-down program. When ADX was originally built, it was designed as a place people went and essentially stayed forever. But over time, partly because of legal pressure and partly because of research showing how damaging permanent isolation is, the Bureau of Prisons introduced what they called a step-down program. The idea was simple. If an inmate at ADX could demonstrate over time that they were not causing problems, not threatening staff, not organizing violence, they could gradually earn slightly better conditions, more time outside the cell, eventually, the possibility of transfer to a lower security facility. For many of the men inside ADX, the step-down program became something extraordinarily powerful. It became hope, and hope, it turns out, is one of the most important survival tools a human being can have. Not hope in a vague, soft sense. Specific hope, measurable hope. The knowledge that if you do this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, your situation will change. Psychologists who study survival in extreme conditions, including prisoners of war and people who have survived long periods of captivity, consistently find that the people who make it through are the ones who can hold on to a concrete vision of a future, not just a wish, a plan. The men at ADX who latched onto the step-down program gave themselves a plan. They tracked their behavior. They stayed disciplined. They found ways to manage their anger and their fear because they understood that losing control, even once, could cost them months of progress. In a place designed to strip away all control, they had found one small piece of it, and they held on to it like a lifeline. But here is the question that this whole story has been building toward. What happens when a man does everything right? When he survives the isolation, holds his mind together, completes the step-down program, and finally walks out of ADX Florence? What does the world look like to someone who has been inside a concrete box for a decade or more? And is it even remotely possible that some of what they experienced inside, some of what they were forced to develop just to stay sane, actually gave them something unexpected, something that most people walking free in the outside world do not have? The answer is coming, and it is not what you think. If this story is getting to you, if you are feeling something watching this, tell us in the comments what part hit you the hardest. We genuinely want to know what you are thinking right now. Travis Dusenberry was not a name that appeared in many headlines. He was not a terrorist. He was not a spy. He was not someone whose case had been debated on television or written about in major newspapers. He was just a man who ended up at ADX Florence and spent years inside that silence, inside that concrete, inside that 7x12 box that the rest of the world had essentially forgotten about. And then one day, after more than a decade, he walked out. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating things we found in all of our research on this place. Travis described his first experiences back in a regular prison environment, because ADX is so extreme that even transferring to a normal high-security prison counts as a dramatic change, with the kind of disbelief that is hard to fully absorb. Simple things overwhelmed him. The sound of multiple people talking at the same time felt like chaos. The presence of other bodies moving through a shared space, something every single person reading this experiences every day without a second thought, felt threatening and deeply uncomfortable. He had been alone for so long that other people had become the strange thing. Solitude had become normal. Human contact had become the foreign experience. He described standing in a room with other inmates and feeling completely lost. Not because he did not know the rules, not because anyone was threatening him, but because the social instincts that most of us use without even thinking, the ability to read a face, to sense what someone means by their tone of voice, to know when to speak and when to stay quiet, had gone quiet inside him from years of having no use. It was like a muscle that had not been used in so long, had almost forgotten how to work. And here is what makes Travis Dusenberry's story so important to this documentary. He was one of the ones who made it. He was one of the ones who held himself together inside ADX, who found his footing, who did not completely collapse the way Jack Powers did. By any measure of surviving that place, Travis had done it. And yet coming out was its own kind of battle. This is the part of the ADX story that almost never gets told. Everyone focuses on what happens inside. The conditions, the isolation, the psychological damage. But the exit, the moment when it is finally over, turns out to be its own crisis for many men who have been there. The world had kept moving while they were frozen in place. Technology had changed. Social rules had shifted. Family relationships, already stretched thin by years of almost no contact, had in many cases simply broken. Some men came out to find that the people they had been holding onto in their minds, the faces they had been picturing during those long silent hours, had moved on completely. The mental image they had been using to survive had, in some cases, stopped existing in the real world. That gap between the world a person holds in their mind during isolation and the world that actually exists when they come out is something researchers are only beginning to study seriously. And what they are finding is that it may be one of the most significant and least discussed consequences of long-term solitary confinement. But now, we need to go back inside, because there is one more layer to the story that we have not uncovered yet. Remember when we talked about the men who found ways to survive by turning their minds into tools? The ones who memorized texts, who wrote thousands of words, who organized a legal case from inside concrete boxes. There is a psychological explanation for why that worked, and it is genuinely surprising. When the human brain is deprived of external stimulation, it does not simply go quiet. It does not power down like a phone left on a table. It searches, it reaches, it looks for something to process, something to engage with. Because that is what brains are built to do. They are pattern-finding machines. They are meaning-making engines. And when the outside world gives them almost nothing to work with, they turn inward. For most people, that inward turn becomes destructive relatively quickly. With no positive structure to follow, the brain starts looping on fears, on regrets, on anxious thoughts that spiral and grow. This is what produces the paranoia and hallucinations associated with Schuh's syndrome. The brain is not malfunctioning exactly. It is doing what it was designed to do. It is just doing it with no good material to work with, so it starts generating its own, and what it generates in that environment is almost always dark. But here is the discovery that changes the picture. The men who gave their brains something real to work with, a problem to solve, a text to memorize, a legal argument to construct, a drawing to complete, essentially redirected that inward energy. Instead of the brain feeding on itself, it was fed. It had a task. It had a direction. And what researchers have found, in studies not just of prisoners, but of monks, of people in sensory deprivation experiments, and of long-distance solo sailors who spend weeks at sea alone, is that when a mind is given structure and purpose in conditions of extreme isolation, something remarkable can sometimes happen. Focus deepens in a way that is almost impossible to achieve in normal life. Think about your own daily experience. How many times do you sit down to concentrate on something, only to be pulled away by a notification, a sound, a person walking by, a thought about something else you need to do? The modern world is a constant interruption machine. Real, deep focus, the kind where you lose track of time because you are so absorbed in what you are doing, is increasingly rare. In a cell at ADX Florence, there are no notifications. There are no interruptions. There is nothing pulling at your attention except the task in front of you and the thoughts inside your head. For the men who chose to use that, who chose to treat that silence as a resource rather than a punishment, the focus they developed was extraordinary. Several former inmates have described entering states of concentration so deep that hours would pass without them noticing. Not because they were dissociating or losing touch with reality, but because they were genuinely, completely absorbed. One man described working through complex legal arguments in his head for hours at a stretch, turning them over, examining them from different angles, finding the weak points and strengthening them, in a way that he said he had never been capable of before he went to ADX. The irony that he had to lose everything to develop that particular skill was not lost on him. This does not mean that ADX Florence is acceptable. It does not mean that solitary confinement is secretly beneficial. The evidence is overwhelming and clear that long-term isolation causes serious, lasting harm to the vast majority of people who experience it. What it means is something more specific and more human than that. It means that even inside one of the most deliberately dehumanizing environments ever constructed, the human mind kept looking for a way to be more than its circumstances. And some of the time, against every odd, it found one. Now, we come to the final piece of this story. The question that has been sitting underneath everything we have talked about today. Is ADX Florence still operating the way it was designed to operate? The answer is yes. And in recent years, it has become the subject of fresh controversy. In 2025, a group of prisoners whose death sentences had been commuted, meaning their punishments had been officially reduced, were transferred to ADX Florence as what many legal experts described as a deliberate act of punishment. The American Civil Liberties Union and the Center for Constitutional Rights challenged these transfers in court, arguing that sending people to ADX under those specific circumstances was unconstitutional. The legal battle is ongoing. What it reveals is that ADX Florence is not a relic from a different era of American justice. It is not something that was built in a different time with different values and has since been reformed away. It is active, it is full, and the debates about what it does to human beings, debates that began before the prison even opened its doors, are still happening right now. There are men inside those walls tonight, men in 7 by 12 cells. Men who will slide their food tray back through the slot after eating. Men who will lie on concrete in the dark and do whatever it is they have figured out how to do to make it to tomorrow. Some of them will find something to hold on to. A prayer, memory, a legal argument, a drawing taking shape in their mind. Something that makes tomorrow feel worth reaching for. Some of them will not find it, and the silence will take pieces of them that they will never get back. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in a story that is equal parts brutal and astonishing, the human mind keeps doing what it has always done. It keeps trying, not because anyone told it to, not because the conditions gave it any reason to, but because that is what minds do. They push toward the light, even when the light is nothing but a sliver of sky through a window placed too high to see out of. Thomas Silverstein drew pictures for decades and never stopped. Travis Dusenberry walked out into a world that felt like a foreign country and tried to learn it again from scratch. The men who built a legal case from inside concrete boxes changed the conditions for hundreds of people they had never met and would likely never meet. None of them were supposed to be able to do any of that. They did it anyway. And that, more than anything else in this story, the thing worth sitting with. Not the concrete, not the silence, not the darkness. The fact that even there, even in the place designed to make a person feel like nothing, something in the human being refuses to agree. It refuses to be nothing. It keeps reaching. It keeps building. It keeps trying to make something out of whatever it has left. That is the real story of ADX Florence. Not what the prison does to people, but what people do back. If this documentary made you think, made you feel something, or changed the way you see something you had never considered before, please share it with one person today. Just one. Because stories like this only reach people when someone decides they are worth passing on. And if you want to see more documentaries like this one, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because we go this deep every single time. Every video we make is built on real research, real facts, and real stories that most people never get to hear. We will see you in the next one.